Who would cause your heart to flutter if they walked in the door now? Would it be the bishop or the prime minister? Maybe the king? Would it make your heart race a little bit if you saw someone that you'd seen on television? Brian Cox. I had an interchange with Geraldine Doog by email when we were looking for someone to host the Meet the Candidates. And it was a great privilege to meet her in person, but I wouldn't say my heart was fluttering. Not like for you, Alison. Who would make your blood pressure rise, your heart start to beat faster if they walked in the door? Jack Bennett, indeed. With good reason. Can you think of someone? Think of someone, a musician, an artist, someone of great knowledge or someone of great expertise. Who would cause you to be excited when they walked in the door? And what is it about them that would cause you to be according honour to them? What are the things that cause us to worship? The psalm today is a recitation, a remembering. You know, after funerals sometimes I encourage people to tell the stories of their loved one, because the remembering is literally putting the pieces back together. My arm is a member of my body, and so when I remember my arm to my body, I put myself back together. And so telling the stories helps us to put that person back together in our memory, in our person. For people in ministry, especially difficult ministry, I encourage them to note great breakthroughs and keep a mental mantelpiece where they keep those memorials or trophies of the work of God in their midst, so that they can be encouraged when it feels like nothing ever works and nothing goes right. Those dry times are the times when we need more than ever to remember, to reassemble the pieces of the story so that we get the bigger picture. In the psalm, it recites a wide range of reasons why we might worship God. It says about where he sits, enthroned on the cherubim, let the earth quake. And so, not just a spirit in heaven, but a spirit in heaven that makes the earth move. God is great in Zion, is exalted over the people. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. Calling to worship, but then affirming that God's holiness, that purity, that completeness, that holy otherness of God requires of us a response. And then, mighty King, lover of justice, you have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. The work of God that brings us to a place where we can live together in peace and community, in relationship, where righteousness is done. That deserves a response. In our Old Testament reading today, we see Moses engaging with God in conversation. This is a God who can be known, who engages with his people and invites them into conversation. This is a God who is intimately known. It's said that God knows our inmost thoughts and has known us from the beginning of time. who knew us before we were knit together in our mother's womb, who knows us and invites us to know, to engage, to be in relationship. I'm not sure what you named when you said what were the reasons that Jack might cause your heart to flutter when he walked in the door. I know for Alison, some would say, of course you love her, she's such a great cook. Well, that's ridiculous. Because I know lots of great cooks, but I don't love them. I know that in my relationship with Alison, there is an intimacy and a knownness that accepts me as I am. Even when I jump in before the gospel, she still loves me and accepts me. She knows me and affirms my personhood just because she loves me. This evokes a response from me. I love her back. I give myself to her. And this is what God is inviting us into. A responding to the love that we have received. A giving of ourselves to a God who has given God's self to us. Moses had to strive with God to get an interview. But God sent Jesus among us so that God's face would be seen by people and live. That not only would God's face be seen, but we would see what God would do with hands and feet. And then we see the Pharisees. Now, the Psalms continue to be remembering the nature of God in the Jewish tradition today. We carry them in our tradition because we need to remember. But trends change. Focus changes. And faithfulness looks different to every generation. To this generation, it seemed that Jesus kept on running into this practice of faithfulness, which was petty and very detailed. And so they measured their faithfulness by how carefully they followed the law. Jesus invited them to a different place. In the gospel reading today, they tried to trap him. They tried to get him into a place where he would lose. A, bad idea. How many times have they tried that and it's not worked? And B, why does he need to lose? Why can't he win? So they pull up a dead-end argument. Should we give tax to Caesar? Now, you and I know that tax is one of the three certainties of life. Death, taxes, and death. Two certainties. Death and taxes. But for them, the image of the Roman coin couldn't come into the temple. You know, the money changers, they had to change the money because the Roman coin was had Tiberius Caesar, August, son of the divine Augustus, so God, and on the other side, Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. It was blasphemy. It couldn't come into the house of God because it was blasphemy. And yet, Jesus says, so show me a coin, and somehow one appears right there in the midst. Wonder how that got there. His invitation is not to consider the nature of taxation or to step into their political argument, or even, I think, to dodge their trap, but rather to invite them to consider what it is that makes their heart race. We talk a lot about justice. We do a lot about justice because we're following the nature of God and we're doing what God has called us to do. For them, following the law was getting their heart to race. Jesus' invitation was to consider whether actually the roots of their motivation were coming from worship of God, or just doing the right thing, or being seen to do the right thing, or being popular with the people, or being in power. They say in order to better listen that we need to step into a person's shoes, to listen from their perspective. It's hard sometimes to listen to people who speak blasphemy in our midst. I suggest that there are many people who try to be faithful today who undermine the very work that they're trying to do. And in seeking to be more faithful, are actually failing to be faithful at all. How do we know? How do we avoid the trends? How do we set ourselves in the place where we can be real and true in front of God and make ourselves engage with God in a way that is healthy for us and worshipful to God? Well, reading the text. The Gospels help us to understand because we see the face of God at work with people. The Psalms invite us to reflect and to remember. The Old Testament, the prophets, call us back to what is truly following God. And the other stories show us what happens when we don't. Not all of them, but many of them. So when you run into trouble in the Old Testament, find an easier passage, one that tells you more about God. I understand that some of the Old Testament is difficult to read, and it is rightly so, because there are really ugly things that happen in the Bible, because it doesn't shrink away from any of the truths of our civilization. But our invitation today is to worship. What does it mean to worship? To remember, to give ourselves to God, because God has given God's self to us. To open ourselves to the work of God in our life, to be present, and then to do the things that God does. To execute justice and righteousness. Amen.